Ladies and gentlemen, your event will now begin. Jeff, please go ahead.
Thank you, Zach, and hello, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Metz, and I'll be your moderator for today's webcast titled Artificial Intelligence in Contract Management, Fact, Not Fiction. This event is brought to you by Corporate Counsel and sponsored by Ultria. It's great to have everyone here today for our event. Before we actually get to the topic, let's get some simple housekeeping items out of the way. This event is completely interactive and incorporates many of today's social media tools. You can tweet or directly post information to your Facebook and LinkedIn page right from the console. You don't have to open a new browser to do so. Just scroll along the bottom of the screen and click on the social networking widget of your choice. And in fact, we encourage you to do so. Also, if you have a question for one of our speakers, please enter it into the Q&A widget on your console. We will get to your question during the event or during the live Q&A at the end, depending on time. We'll answer as many questions as possible, so we invite you to ask away. And if we don't get to your question by the end, you may receive an email response. In addition, there are some customizable functions to be aware of. Every window you currently see, from the slide window to the Q&A panel, can be either enlarged or collapsed, so if you want to change the look and feel of your console, go right ahead. Now, let's get to today's topic. Incorporating artificial intelligence into the contract management lifecycle can drive efficiencies, reduce risks, and improve the value derived from contracts. But how do you get about incorporating AI into your contract process? And more importantly, once you do, what next? Here with us to discuss the myths, realities, and best practices of inserting AI in the contract management lifecycle are Andrew Bartels, VP and Principal Analyst at Forrester, and Arthur Raguette, Executive Vice President of Ultria. Andy and Art, I know we have a lot of information to cover today, so I'll just hand it off to you.
Well, Jeff, thank you very much. This is Arthur Raguette, and I'd like to start off by thanking Andrew Bartels from Forrester for joining us today and really starting our session with his experience, his insights, and his familiarity with the contract lifecycle management space. Andy primarily contributes to the Forrester's offerings for the CIO. As an analyst, he is the leading expert on technical market trends and sizing, cloud and smart computing technologies, technology budget benchmarks and processes, and technology's impact on business operations. He also researches the growing customization of technology systems for industry-specific solutions for utilities, energy, government, education, and professional service sectors. He is a thought leader in buy-side technologies and business networks, and has been with Forrester for over 15 years, starting with Giga Information Group, which Forrester acquired in 2003. Myself, my name is Arthur Raguette. I'm a founder and Executive Vice President of Ultria, and my passion has always been in the application of cutting-edge technologies to global, large-scale challenges that today's organizations face. Our agenda today is fairly detailed. Our goal, though, is to start off with a high-level reminder for all of us on the call of what is contract management and what is the contract lifecycle. Sometimes we use these terms interchangeably, sometimes not so much. And then once we have this common baseline, let's move forward and take a look at how artificial intelligence may or may not address gaps in the contract management process. We'll spend some time looking at artificial intelligence innovations as it pertains to the contract repositories, reporting, analysis, contract authoring, creation, negotiation, and integrating contract platforms with your operational systems with the final and ultimate goal of ensuring that we're optimizing the value realized in our contracts today. With that, I'd like to turn the mic over, so to speak, to Andrew Bartels. Andy, take it away.
Thank you very much, Art, and thank you for that warm introduction. As Art indicated, we're going to be talking today about contracts and the role they play. And so, contracts are a critical part of business. They've been a critical part of business for many years. But the role of contracts in today's world is even greater than it has been in the past. And that's because more and more of business relationships are moving into online or digital channels. plus, more and more business relationships are becoming specific to customers, suppliers. And as those two trends, more and more online activities, more and more digital activities, and more customized relationships, the role of contracts for defining those relationships becomes even more important. So the value of contracts to business continues to be at the heart of the value, but there's an equal value that lies from the perspective of legal. That's because contracts actually play a dual role. If you think about contract language, contracts play, first role they play is they define who does what at what price when everything works as planned. And on a day-to-day basis, that represents 95% of the contract value. But on the other hand, only about 10% of contract language actually is devoted to those tasks of defining who does what. Instead, 90% of the contract language is devoted to the issue of defining who is responsible or liable when things don't work as planned. So on a day-to-day basis, that rarely crops up, but when it does crop up, it can be a really big deal that can cost tens of millions of dollars, even more than that sometimes. So in fact, these two parts of contracts have equal value. You know, the day-to-day value in executing contracts effectively, but also that longer-run value of making sure that contracts protect you from misbehavior, from bad performance, from other factors that might be part of this. So with that, we're going to jump into the agenda and look specifically at what is contract management, what is contract lifecycle management. A contract is, of course, not a static document. The contract is, in fact, a life cycle that typically starts with the initial drafting and negotiation of an agreement between two parties. But in some cases, that contract doesn't come from you. It comes from the counterparty. So you also have to import that counterparty's contract and work off of that. Once a contract is finalized and signed, it then needs to become accessible. So that means it gets stored into a repository where it then can be accessed both by people and by systems who need that contract information for managing the business relationship. That's where contract compliance administration comes in. In some cases, that's done automatically by linking transaction systems that need contract data to execute effectively. In other cases, through the relationship manager, the vendor manager, who needs that data every time they talk with their counterparty or communicate with their counterparty to make sure that they understand what is expected on their side and expected on the other side. So contract compliance and administration, though, simply means that you have executed a contract the way that you expected it to. But the expectations of contracts don't always line up with expected business results. This is where contract optimization comes in. We expected to get certain benefits from this contract we signed with our customer, but for some reason we're not. Why is that? What's wrong with our contract? What's missing? What should we have added? What do we have that's creating problems? How can we make our contract better? And of course, every contract sooner or later will come to an end, and it needs to be reviewed and determine how it's going to be changed, extended, or not extended. And that, of course, then brings the cycle back to creating a new contract and doing that. And what we at Forrester call contract lifecycle management is software that handles the entire cycle of all these activities. Now, each of these stages, parts of it, actually have the unique set of value, and indeed the unique step they play in implementation. Now, the sequence you see here can be viewed as the 6 sources of value, but it can also be viewed as typically the 6 steps in implementation. Now, things don't necessarily flow in this fashion all the time. Some people jump, for example, at contract creation and then work backwards. But the most common scenario for implementation is, in fact, through these stages. And so the first stage of value and typically first stage of implementation is getting all your contracts in a repository. That has the benefit that anyone who needs that contract information can, with appropriate authorization, find it, review it, access it, and have it in their fingertips, as opposed to having to call down to the legal department and say, hey, can you pull that contract and send it to me? And of course, that availability has a secondary benefit, means that you don't lose track of contracts, and therefore you don't lose track of renewals that you want to either renew or not renew. The next stage of implementation is typically generating reports and analysis about the contract portfolio. How many duplicates do we have? How many conflicts do we have? What are the obligations we have across a portfolio? What are the rights that we have across a portfolio? Having full visibility into what the financial, business, legal risk obligations of your contracts is a second key source of value to reports and analytics. The third stage typically is contract creation. This is a mechanism that allows end business users to log into the system, to go through a short interview or wizard to identify the business purpose, and then use that information to create for them a draft contract that they then can mark up, and they can then put the appropriate data in and turn the contract. Now, as they do so, the systems will have controls over what can and can't be changed. So if legal says this language cannot be changed, the end business you can't change it. If there are things that can be changed, though, it then has workflow and rules that say if this is changed, it needs to be approved by A, head of sales, or B, chief purchasing officer, or C, regional sales manager, or D, someone in legal. So it allows end users to create contracts on their own, but with all the legal controls that legal wants to have in the contract. So this has a number of benefits. It allows much more efficient use of legal staff, because rather than have to review every single contract, they only get called in when the system alerts them that there's a deviation. Of course, it speeds up cycle time, because without having to have contracts stuck in a legal review, you can close them faster. And of course, closing a contract faster often results in closing revenues, booking revenues faster. The fourth stage of value lies when you're linking a CLM system into what we call upstream apps. What's an upstream app? Well, for example, if you're in a CRM system and you're tracking a lead, that's an upstream app, your lead management apps. That's what we would use to identify a sales lead that then feeds into your contract when you close a deal. Or it could be on the buy side, a sourcing application used to run a sourcing event and choose a supplier or suppliers, and then those get turned into a contract. So those are upstream apps, and you want that smooth toggling between those so a worker, an employee who's involved in managing a lead and turning a contract can be operating with both, or someone in purchasing can be operating in a sourcing event, and smoothly turn to contract negotiation. The fourth stage is linking transactions that need contract data into the CLM system so those contract terms and conditions can be fed into that transaction system. That means more complete and effective compliance with contract benefits and commitments, whether it's on the buy side, where you're expecting to get savings from the supplier, and you want to realize that, or it's on the sell side, where you've committed to sell certain things at certain prices with certain service levels, and you want to make sure you live up to those, otherwise there might be penalties. And the last stage is that improving contract optimization, where you're using data, using information, using the results you're getting from the business relationships defined by contracts to identify gaps, shortcomings, things in the contract language that prevent you from realizing those benefits. And of course, ultimately then turn into better contracts that give you better business value. Now, these stages of contract lifecycle are important because they also tie to different stakeholders in different ways. One of the things that makes CLM such a complicated product is you have a lot of different stakeholders who have a keen interest and usage in CLM solutions. It's not just a solution that's used by general counsels. It's also used by chief purchasing officers, used by head of sales, increasingly used by CFOs, and even used by CIOs. But each of these stakeholders see different sources of value. So general counsels are mostly interested in CLM up to the point the contract is signed. After signing, it said that's not our problem. On the other hand, CPOs and head of sales They're very interested in things like contract creation because that helps them to book business quicker, but their real value lies in the linkage to upstream apps and their contract compliance. And so that's where they get involved in it. CFOs are getting much more involved because of the understanding or realization that contracts have direct impacts on the finances of the company in terms of obligations that they have to be prepared to pay or of revenues they may be getting. And so CFOs are becoming more and more involved in this process. But because each stakeholder looks at this through different lenses of value, they in turn make it how to coordinate those and get them all together a very complicated task. So that's the backdrop to CLM. With that backdrop in place, let's move on to the next stage of our discussion, which is the role that AI can play in each of these areas. And Art's going to be joining me as we go through this and talking about what his company can bring to bear around applying AI to this. So let's start with the gaps that exist within CLM typically. And while CLM solutions are getting very good, there still are a number of issues that exist. One of the major ones is importing contracts, especially third-party contracts. It's not just a matter of getting a contract into the system in the repository. It's also a matter of how do you apply the right metadata tags to the right parts of the language in the contract so that it actually is correctly tagged for reporting, for searching, for analytics. It's another challenge, which is given that the goal is to get employees to use the system, how do you guide them to the right contract for the right purpose? How do you make it a simple, easy process to do, especially for an employee who may come into the system once every 3 months? There is, of course, the task of how to get business and legal working together on finalizing the last detail of the contract, make sure it gets done correctly. There's another issue which arises that typically when you set up a CLM system, you do it with a set of metadata tags that you think will address the issues that you need, and your reports and analysis run on that. But what happens when a new topic comes along? One topic that's been in the news a lot is GDPR, governing the European laws governing privacy, which suddenly make companies go, well, how many contracts do we have that might be subject to this? Could be a change in tax law. Could be something else. Well, you may have a metadata tag for that. So now you want to figure out how can we actually find that language when we didn't create a metadata tag for that. I identified earlier the task of integrating CLM systems to transaction systems for order management or for purchasing management. That's still a challenge. How do you get those systems to speak together? How can you link CLM to joining apps that are upstream? And there's managing unanticipated risks in the contracts. Again, GDPR being an example of that. And lastly, there is this really big challenge of how do we make sure that our contracts actually, in practice, meet our business objectives. So AI is being used to try and address each of these gaps in contract management, trying to make it work a little bit better. For example, one of the areas that AI is being added through in the form of innovations is around the contract repository and reporting analysis. I mentioned already the challenge of importing legacy and third-party contracts. So here AI is being used in the form of natural language processing and machine learning to import the contract and to go through that contract language by language, word by word, paragraph by paragraph, and determine what is the indemnity clause, what's the intellectual property clause, what's the governing law clause, whatever the other issues are, and apply the appropriate metadata tags to those relevant terms and conditions. So that rather than having a person do that manually, the system can do it automatically. The other challenge was one I identified before, which is that when we set up the metadata categories, we may not have included new issues we need to address. So the use of semantic analysis and natural language processing to find clusters of relevant words that relate to the issue across the contract portfolio is a way of dealing with that. If, for example, GDPR, which I keep going back to, is finding all the contracts that might use the words privacy or the customer or client or confidentiality in proximity, saying that probably is a reference that would be a GDPR one. So, Art, I know you folks are working on this. You want to talk a little bit about that?
No, great, Andy. Thanks very much. For some of the things that we've run using the Ultria platform, and we've really, I think, embodied and embraced artificial intelligence across the life cycle. The 2 points that you've just raised, the first being able to support importing third-party paper, whether it's a legacy load or sort of a heritage load of existing contracts or merging contract repositories, or just files on a shared drive someplace, or whether it is a merger and acquisition kind of risk analysis. That first challenge of interpreting and understanding contract language is really best overcome using artificial intelligence. So bringing a contract in that wasn't written on your paper and having the software look for those key terms, those key words, using a semantic, a structural, and a sentiment level analysis allows us to identify paragraph by paragraph what clause that may more closely map to, and not just whether it's an indemnity clause, but is it inbound or outbound indemnification? Is it closest to your default? Is it closer to alternate 3? Is it more similar to your fallback? And being able to identify that and sort of assign a level of match is certainly, I think, has been an enabler for many of our customers. It's just the start, so to speak, because once we've done that kind of core extraction, then we have the ability to provide that sort of secondary set, which is go through and identify, once that AI engine has been tuned or has learned from typically a legacy load, being able to go through and identify, I'll say, clause-level compliance or risk. Not performance, not variance, but just based on pure contract clause wording. How close is this particular agreement to an organization's preferred standard? And not that we pretend to be as smart as a counsel nor as experienced, but it provides this kind of directional guidance, and certainly on common kinds of agreements can help triage and even route particular agreements or excerpts from agreements, clauses and clusters, to the right level of legal professional. Could this be the entry-level legal professional? Could this be your outsourced LPO? Could it be outside counsel? Ultimately, could it be inside counsel? And do that somewhat intelligently, I think, based on the AI algorithms. One of the things that we've seen as a value add, and again, purely from an AI perspective, is to be able to take third-party content on the import, whether it's in batch, as I mentioned, or even on the one-off. Someone crafting a high-value sales agreement. Oftentimes we use customer paper if they're simply larger. But to go through and just identify which clauses are missing that are showstoppers for you. Or just as importantly, as we can see on screen, identify those paragraphs that maybe are not even defined, they're no title, maybe just buried words inside of someplace else, where there is clause information, clause wording that you want to know about, so that maybe you can edit, exclude, or at least catch somebody who might have tried to embed a modified limitation of liability inside of an indemnification clause. Things that simply happen, whether it's by habit or by cause, so to speak. But a great use of artificial intelligence if I'm doing this across a 140-page agreement. With that in hand, as you've identified the clauses that it may be there, sometimes in a complex agreement, and I'm sure we'll come to this a little bit later in the Q&A because I can just hear the questions coming in now. You need to be able to do this on more than just a base agreement. I have a master agreement, I've got sub-agreements, or I've got schedules of work or statements of work or sales orders or design docs. Depending on the kind of agreement that someone is running and the domain type, for lack of a better term, there may be auxiliary docs that are required. To use a purchasing example, the requirement that a COI is also submitted. Let's make sure that it's the right kind of certificate of insurance. Do some high-level analysis to make sure coverage types are well-defined or the like. Ultimately, I think what people are trying to do and what the Ultria software helps companies do is create their sort of internal risk scorecard based on contract wording. It's based on sometimes party performance. Could be based on other factors, but it's something that unless you can consistently and programmatically do this kind of risk analysis, is very hard to come up with an objective measure of contract risk. And certainly this pertains to those folks maybe on the extended value chain on the supply side, whether it's rootstock through service provider, but it's just as likely to matter, as you said, this is not just a general counsel issue, this could be a business issue, but help sales organizations ensure which customers are risky, and to the point about renewals, change whether or not this is an agreement that you may want to renew. So, in summary, I think from an AI perspective, leveraging artificial intelligence both on the import and then on the tail end in terms of risk analysis is a great enabler. If you can get the repository loaded accurately with identified clause and, of course, extracted metadata and values so that you can have intelligent triggers, then it makes that risk analysis all the more automated and therefore much more consistent. Back to you.
Art, thanks for that. Now, the next area where we're seeing AI playing a role is in the contract creation negotiation phases. So one of the challenges is something we talked about earlier. Again, the role of a good CLM system is to allow the end business users to create the right contract. But how do we do that? How do we make sure that the end user does that? And especially if it's someone who hasn't used the system in 3 months because they haven't been involved in contract negotiation. So here what we're seeing vendors doing is adding combinations of text analysis, natural language processing, and decision management to engage with users in a dialogue to help better understand their business objectives. And by understanding the business objectives as well as the other attributes of the respective relationship, to then guide them to make sure they include in the contract just the right terms and conditions that are appropriate for that business need. So in effect, create a very smart wizard that can engage in the kind of dialogue a lawyer would have to help make sure that first draft includes everything that's correct. Now, having created that draft, you still have the issue of how do you make sure that when there are changes that an end user creates that deviate from company policy, how do you streamline that process? How do you get decisions rapidly coming from legal as to whether or not a deviation that the end user has inserted is appropriate or not? Here we find vendors using robotic process automation and rules engines to determine which deviations can be approved automatically or which ones need to be routed to other places to get the right person reviewing it and making sure the right decision is made. This is very much a training process. But if, for example, your standard governing law is, let's say, state of Delaware or state of California, and a salesperson has inserted governing law is state of Alabama, well, the first few times, the lawyers might want to approve that. But after that, they could say, any other time that state of Alabama comes in and it's an Alabama client, that's fine. That becomes part of the RPA process. It gets approved automatically, and the lawyers don't need to see that again. So those are two areas we're seeing AI creeping into the contract negotiation, contract creation phase. So, Art, over to you as to what you at Ultria are doing.
Andrew, thanks very much. It's interesting. We think about robotic process automation, and we wonder whether that's actually AI or is it just rules behind the scenes. And I think you used a very interesting term, the idea of having a smart wizard. The days of simply guiding someone through a 5 or 10-step process and having a few decision trees are quickly behind us. Now the dynamics of business, your example about changing governing law as an example. Do you want to write rules that say, okay, Delaware is our norm, Alabama is okay if it's a big customer and it's Johnny in sales? Those become unwieldy very, very quickly. So they stop being used. And once they stop being updated, then the user experience is less than positive, and very soon you have a trailing adoption, and we're right back to sending an email to Sandy in legal and asking her to take care of something for you. So, the process of having an intelligence within the wizard, leveraging the AI tool to take even input, I'll say third-party, content, and disassembling it and understanding the optimal route and the optimal way to guide a user towards the right path is key. It could be something simple, deciding whether a paper that was loaded from a customer is a mutual non-disclosure or unilateral, and then how you may want to handle that. Or the idea of governing laws, very straightforward. What we've done with Ultria is created a wizard environment that not just interprets the information that it's given, whether it's by keystroke or by document load, but leverages its overall learning from the legal process and provides this kind of input or this intelligent triage that feeds into a workflow engine. And that workflow engine can be as dynamic and as flexible to the point of being able to route individual clauses to business users based on variation. So, if it was a 100% good doc, but the governing law was off, okay, that's maybe a quick call to entry-level legal professional. If this has got a limitation of liability that's hedged on future revenue stream on a commodity market, maybe I need someone with a little bit more industry experience to take a look at this. That is facilitated directly through the workflow tool. And it's funny, on the screen today, we're looking at an actual screenshot of our workflow tool. And people often say, well, it looks like Little Tikes heads or Lego heads. It is meant to be that straightforward because business requirements for updates to the workflow and the decisioning should be simple, should be easy to go ahead and make modifications to. This enables both the casual user, the person who comes in once a quarter, to be guided by the platform and let the platform provide the guardrails or the bumpers, if you will, to facilitate information capture, to ensure that the information is vetted and checked, and can really reduce that intake process, both in terms of time and I'll say maybe more importantly, reduce the risk associated with the intake process, the miscommunication, the mistranslations, if you will, with that end result being as straight through a process as possible without ever bypassing any of the business critical routing and decision and checking and vetting that today's global organization requires. Andrew, back to you.
Well, thank you. So moving to the next area of AI innovation, this is around contract integration. There are two sets of challenges around integration. One lies in the linkage of CLM to transaction systems. The other lies in the linkage of CLM to related sibling or upstream applications. So in the first area, we're seeing AI being used as a means of defining or programming the APIs, the application programming interfaces, that are increasingly being used as the channel, the vehicle for integrating CLM data into procurement systems or into order management systems in order to provide that data for automated compliance. The other area of integration lies in linking CLM to those related apps, the sibling apps, as we call them, or the upstream apps. Now, one approach here is for vendors to create a single suite that includes all these things together. And that's not necessarily a bad approach. It can work pretty well. But not everybody wants to use a whole suite. They may want to actually be able to use specialist applications like CLM that can work with other applications. So creating a kind of AI platform that can allow that smooth integration, both in terms of the data flow, but also in terms of the user interface. So that even if the adjoining apps are not on a different platform than the CLM ones, it can still look and feel as if it's similar, as if the employee who's using it doesn't feel like they're moving out of one system into another system, but have a more seamless, smooth environment, even though behind the scenes, if they're separate applications. And so AI is being cropped up in those areas to make those transitions, make that integration work more smoothly. So, Art, what are you folks doing around using AI in those areas?
It's interesting, and you raised an interesting point in terms of sort of the staging or prepping of the APIs. For us, we see this as an extension of the three Eases, right? So ease of access, ease of use. If you have both of those, then you have ease of adoption. You can sort of help overcome the challenges of organizational change. I mean, somebody said the tipping point is 16% of the audience. If they make the commitment, then you're pretty much golden. What we found in terms of the integration capabilities and to making it as seamlessly fluid as possible is that by leveraging artificial intelligence predominantly in the understanding of context in addition to content. Right, we talked a little bit about parsing information and understanding it. That's a heck of a good start. But then making that jump to say what else is involved to give you a more accurate route or a more accurate suggestion to enable someone who might be heads down in a procurement system or heads down in a order taking, order management, or CRM platform to be able to seamlessly generate best first draft of an agreement and never really leave their core environment. As a comparative to a full suite, whether it's sell side or buy side, Ultria has taken the position that contract lifecycle as an application drives value in enhancing the asset itself, the contract, and the business value that you drive from it. That being said, in order to maximize the flow through the CLM, we want organizations to use it more by not necessarily changing where their eyeballs are every day. If you're a Salesforce user, excellent. We have a managed app on Salesforce App Exchange. User never has to leave Salesforce. Take an opportunity or an order, flip it into a contract, generate best first draft, maybe route it through internal teams that are not Salesforce users, the insurance, finance, risk, etc. Get that first draft out to the customer, route it back through Salesforce, keep these things updated. But sales management, they don't even need to see that Ultria CLM is powering it, and that it's the AI engine that is optimizing contract clauses and generating this best first draft based on, hopefully, the quality information that was entered in the opportunity within Salesforce. Or similarly, an RFP that's been awarded on a sourcing platform and the ability to flip this award into a contract referencing the contract line items on a price book. And doing this all so that the person in the procure-to-pay or source-to-settle platform simply knows that they pressed a button that said generate draft contract, and everything else pretty much happens behind the scenes. Now, that's an enabler. Again, it's one of those things that both reduces the cycle, and sometimes time is money, and yes, that gets you closer to a deal, and that deal could be flow. And it's funny, we have a customer who monetized their average daily revenue off of a contract. I was amazed at how big that number was, and you do the math, and all of a sudden, after 5 or 6 days, we're talking $1 million or $2. That adds up pretty quick. But it's not always just about time and money. Sometimes it really is about ensuring that the quality of the process has been improved. And this is where we see, to your point, making sure that you've got connections among peer applications. So it's not just necessarily the upstream, but being able to link contract action. And we'll talk a little bit more about, I think, contract performance, compliance, and those kinds of triggers for positive change in a couple of more minutes. But just the basics of being able to drag in other key stakeholders, other collaborators, through the contract authoring or negotiation process, and providing this context information through common desktop environments. Whether it's our extensions for Microsoft Word that provide the CLM and the workflow and the clause and the template libraries directly from someone's Microsoft Office 365 environment, or whether it's linking a Skype-like tool to provide context when you tap somebody for advice, whether that's in-house or whether that's sitting in your LPO offshore on another continent. Being able to quickly bring people up to speed so they can assist in the contract process is empowered by software that reads and understands and effectively abstracts information and summarizes. It's not the same as having an extra lawyer at your fingertips, but it's certainly an enabler to get people talking along the right side of things. Now, I think there are certainly a larger set of peer applications, and I know Forrester has done some great work in understanding what those are and how the CLM should interact with it. Andy, you want to talk to that a little?
Certainly. So far we've talked about some obvious ones, sourcing, for example, and its linkage into buy-side contracts, procurement, systems leading that. We've talked about order management. We've talked about Salesforce automation tools as a lead. But that's not all of them. For example, revenue management is linked off to sales-side contracts. Proposal management can be a precursor to the contract. CPQ can be used both to help define the terms of the contract, but then also the contract sets parameters that get executed in the actual process through CPQ. And on the buy side, linkage of the contract terms into invoicing to check the invoice is correct. Linking into project management systems, so it involve multiple parties and tying the contracts together. And linkage into risk management systems. So the point is that contracts and CLM actually link to many, many processes. So integration is a key, integration into those enhanced by AI is a key source of value. So let's move to the last stage of value and where we think AI can play a role. So certainly one of the key challenges in any contract is making sure you get full contract compliance. So after you've done the linkage of CLM into transaction systems, then being able to apply diagnostic analytics to identify contract leakages or instances of contract noncompliance that you can use to improve that, to make sure that, in fact, the contracts are performing as they're expected. Another challenge is improving a contracting process, so using process analytics and robotic process automation to identify and remove bottlenecks and delays in the contracting process. But these are also precursors to the ultimate goals of making sure you're achieving your business goals. If you have a gap between a contract and your business goals, you first want to make sure that gap is not caused because of contract noncompliance. But if you know that the contract is being complied with, either by your side or by the other party's side, and you're still not getting the business results, now you can start to do diagnosis to figure out why is that happening. So applying predictive analytics to compare actual business results against predicted results and seeing what's deviation, what's causing that, what can be used to identify where the contract language that's failing to produce the expected results. The language that's causing misbehavior, bad behavior. You could have contract language that actually is encouraging counterparts to do the wrong thing rather than do the right thing and resulting in poor results. So this is where AI is starting to creep into each of these areas. Art, I know you would like to show examples of how Ultria is using AI in these areas.
Oh, absolutely, and because it is sort of at that, to your point, sort of the last objective. It's at a point where we're looking at a maturity model, so to speak, or customer adoption of contract management, beyond just getting agreements signed. When we talk about compliance, certainly you just need exposure. So you need exposure to not just the legal team, maybe not just the risk team, but to the business teams, sales, procurement, HR, depending on the individual teams. So being able to provide dashboard level visibility to let you know where we are not performing. And then to be able to quantify that and maybe bring it down a level to identify not just perhaps where the contract terms may be generating some level of noncompliance, but with those interactions to those peer groups that we talked about, operational platforms, order platforms, just cash management platforms. It gives you an indication as to what may need to be corrected. And because of the entitlements and obligations in the agreement, being able to now use your engine, your contract lifecycle platform, to then recommend not just perhaps the simple fixes, but to actually generate, here's what the rebate should look like. Here's how these SLAs may need to be modified. And to proactively push this information out to those business owners that can then impact the other party. If we look to your earlier example, and I loved it, 95% of the words when everything is good, or 95% of the value, right, versus 90% that comes back when things are not going as planned. Let's make sure we're optimizing our contract value as it pertains to the business itself, and then do that in such a way that you are capturing the interactions between the parties and ensuring that each lever is being appropriately managed. That also comes back to the internal use, your internal processes, not just the business partner performance, but are you running rogue clauses? Are you always editing your default? Is no one ever using the alternates? Things that can simply be indicators of how a legal operations team can better use the curated information within its libraries, for instance. And then, last but sort of not least, being able to sort of trigger down to specific comparatives, whether it be your internal process or your external, and then providing this information, comparative of the goal of the contract versus the realities of operations, and then either modify the organization's behavior or the behavior of the business partner, and be able to do it with facts. I mentioned the term maturity, and I was thinking in terms of sort of organizational maturity, that we see folks who have reached that level of tying the contract process to their other operational platforms. But I think Andrew Bartels has a different view of maturity, and it's one that I honestly smile every time I see this chart. Andy, you want to add some color to this?
Certainly. We at Forrester have been doing a fair amount of work looking at AI and looking at, especially from a client side, how do you assess the maturity of the AI engines, the AI functions that your vendors brought to bear? And so we came up with this maturity framework which translates the maturity of the vendor's offering against human equivalents, human educational equivalents. So we said, look, if the vendor has an AI function that says it's on its roadmap, then that's kind of equivalent of being in pre-K. If they've actually started development on those AI functions and they have it works, it's in kindergarten. If it has those functions in a product that's in test with a few clients, it's kind of like being in third grade. If it actually has those AI functions in its product and it's in the market for a year or so, it's kind of equivalent of being in 8th grade. If it's had those functions in the product, in the market for 2 or 3 years, it might be at 11th grade. If its AI functions have been there for many years, 4 or 5 years, then it's equivalent of college. And this is useful because you can think, is this particular task that the AI engine is supposed to do, is it something we'd feel comfortable with an 8th grader doing? If not, you might want to say, well, we want to wait till it gets to be 11th grader or college level. On the other hand, if it's a fairly simple task, you say, any 11th grader could probably do this reasonably well. So if it's that maturity, that's probably good enough for us. So it's a framework that you can use in talking to vendors and assessing the maturity, and I got not overall, but function by function, as we went through here, whether it's the function of importing a contract and tagging it correctly, or the function of providing the right guidance to someone requesting a contract, or the function of generating the right reports and analysis, or providing integration. So you can use this framework in your interactions with vendors to help make sure that you understand how mature the AI functionality is. And this matters because AI is kind of like human intelligence. It's based upon training and it's based upon knowledge. And so the longer an AI engine has been and works, the more training it's gotten, which is to say the more times it's made mistakes and been corrected, and the more its database of information expanded. So maturity matters. A function that is immature but is still at that 8th grade, 3rd grade level because they simply haven't had the experience in that engine to do what you expect to get really high accuracy, really good results. So with that, Art, I think we'll go towards the concluding issues.
We are, and looking at the clock, I know we're sort of running tight, so how to succeed in CLM implementation?
Well, there's some lessons that we've learned from talking with lots and lots of clients. When I say talk with lots and lots of clients, we literally have talked with over 100 clients in terms of our evaluations, as well as other clients that have handled inquiries from them. And what we've learned from them is sort of these 4 key points in succeeding. First, and most importantly, recognize that CLM is a complex, multi-stage process, and so you have to think holistically across that life cycle. You've got to plan for each of the phases of starting with contract importing, contract reporting and analytics, contract creation, linking to joining systems, and ultimately optimizing your contract. But that holistic view around the process also applies holistically to the stakeholders. As I mentioned earlier, each stakeholder here views CLM through its own lens of value, and those lenses of value differ. So it's critical that you get all the stakeholders involved from the beginning throughout the process. Each understands where they're going to get value. Each understands where they may be a lesser contributor. But there's totality of vision that's important, and that's why it's got to be comprehensive in terms of who gets engaged in this. Another key success factor is not stopping when the contract is signed. This is where legal, as I said, will typically say we're over and done. But legal is not the only stakeholder, as we said. So you've also got to address the phase around contract management, contract compliance, contract optimization, if you're going to get value. Remember, the contract is a goal. It doesn't become reality until the contract gets executed, until it's managed, until it gets worked, until it becomes part of how you're doing business. So you've got to think through the whole process and not just stop the contract creation. And lastly, take advantage of the fact that new solutions are coming that have new advanced functions, especially around utilizing AI to address those functions. And they apply both to the later stage of implementation, which is where the gaps have been, but they also apply to the early stage of implementation, the contract importing, the contract creation, the contract reporting and analytics. And those new functions will make it easier to succeed in CLM implementations. All right, over to you.
Fair enough. Just thinking about the remaining time, for those folks online, will be available, of course, to download the presentation. I thought maybe, if it's okay with you, we can take 1 or 2 questions from what's come in. I think we have a minute or 2. Is that okay?
Sure.
Excellent. So let me see. I like this one. What are the prerequisites for an organization to be able to implement and use AI capabilities? I'm guessing this is an organization that may not be sure that they are ready. What's your answer to that when someone says, how far do I have to have advanced before I can take advantage of AI capabilities?
Well, I think one of the key things we're seeing about AI is that it's not really necessary for end clients to know AI, know what it is, know how to use it. Instead, they should look to their vendors. They should look to the vendors to bring three things to the party. First, any vendor of a CLM system is probably going to know better than any end client what the process should look like, should understand better than any end client where the gaps are that AI can be used. So you want to look to the vendor and say, hey, you're the expert in this. Where's the right place to add AI to deal with those particular issues, challenges that we've talked about? Secondly, the vendor can bring to bear a learning system that draws on not just one client's contracts and needs, but draw on many clients. Have an engine that's been trained for looking at literally hundreds of thousands of contracts from different companies that can give insight and training to that AI engine to work smarter because it's been exposed to that corpus that's much larger than any one client can bring to bear. And the last point is that every vendor in this space that we track is incorporating AI into its solution. But because every vendor is doing so, they may be able to charge a premium for a short period of time, but in all likelihood, AI functionality is going to become part of the base product with no additional charge. So you get AI functionality for free. So it makes most sense to look to a vendor rather than try and solve it yourself. But having said that, you want to look to a vendor who actually has worked with clients who are similar to you. You want to work with a vendor, if you're an insurance company, who has other insurance clients. Because that means that their AI engine has been trained on contracts that insurance companies use. And it's going to be smarter and therefore have a better chance of handling your insurance contracts than a vendor who's never worked with insurance contracts. So look for a vendor who has that maturity we talked about, but also look for a vendor that has enough clients in your industry so you can feel confident its AI engines are smart enough to really understand your needs and give you the kind of results you want.
That's interesting. I mean, we often use the term, all boats rise with the tide. So if your AI engine is learning from, the broad corpus, that gives the edge, so to speak, to each of the customers when you are expanding your contract domains, whether it's buy-side, sell-side, or cross-industry. So
exactly.
Takeaway. What would you say are the more widely deployed AI functionalities? I mean, in our session today, we talked about AI on the RPA, the smart wizard, being able to ad hoc understand a user's request versus importing or disassembly of contracts for extracting metadata and populating a repository versus running contract repository analytics, ripping across to identify potential or existing risk. What do you see as sort of the largest use case today for AI?
I think the most common use case, and we actually documented this in our research we did, is specifically around the contract importing and applying the right metadata tags. That's such a common problem that exists for every company who's implementing CLM. And it's an area where AI can dramatically streamline and simplify that process that pretty much every vendor is working on doing that. In other areas, you have different levels of development, different levels of approach, but certainly far and away the most common one is around that contract importing and the metadata tagging.
Very good. And I think, at least from an Ultria perspective, we've been challenged in the last year and a half. I'd say that we were challenged. We certainly rose to meet that, to go beyond just metadata extraction, but to get into that next level of depth, which is identifying clause similarities and to the point of being able to recommend a negotiation strategy or playbook match or facilitate more contract-specific routing for optimal cycle process. So it's an interesting time to be in the AI space when it comes to contract lifecycle.
Definitely.
I think we have successfully filled our time slot. With that, I would simply and rather profoundly like to thank you, Andy. So our heartfelt thanks to Andrew Bartels, Forrester Research, and to the folks at Corporate Counsel for helping put this together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Art. He's right. That is all the time we have. We do have a few more questions. As mentioned in the beginning, though, we will go ahead and try to get answers to you via email. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us and this very valuable presentation. Special thanks again to Andy and Art for their time and insights, as well as Ultria for their support. If you missed any part of this presentation, remember it will be archived shortly so you can view it again or refer to someone to it. And have a great afternoon.